Thank you. Can y'all hear me okay? Yes. Yes. She says, speak louder. I will speak louder. I am working on a hangover cold from my son who just started daycare, and I've been told by everyone that you will now be sick forever. So here we are. I'm so excited to be here with these brilliant women. I am so excited to celebrate the 10th anniversary of this book festival. Give it up for the state of Mississippi. It's astounding to me. These books are incredibly special, and I'm hoping some of you have read some of them, but after today, all of you will go read all of them. I will introduce them, and then we'll have a conversation about these texts. Katya Apekina, is that how you pronounced your last name?
Yes.
Apekina. Is a novelist, screenwriter, and translator. Her novel, The Deeper the Water, The Uglier the Fish, was named a Best Book of 2018 by Kirkus, BuzzFeed, LitHub, and others, and was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize. She has published stories in various literary magazines and translated poetry and prose for Night Wraps the Sky, writings by and about Mayakovsky, shortlisted for the Best Translated Book Award. Born in Moscow, she currently lives in Los Angeles with her husband, daughter, and dog, and we will be talking about her new book, Mother Doll. Jen Fawkes is the author of Mannequin and Wife, a 2020 Shirley Jackson Award nominee, and Tales the Devil Told Me, a finalist for the 2022 World Fantasy Award for Single Author Story Collection. Your short fiction has also won numerous awards, including the 2021 Porter Fund Literary Prize, and has appeared in One Story, LitHub, the Iowa Review, Swamp Pink, Best Small Fictions, and others. A two-time finalist for the Calvino Prize for Fabulous Fiction, Jen lives in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we will be talking about her new book, Daughters of Chaos. Julia Phillips is the author of the best-selling novel Disappearing Earth, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and one of the New York Times Book Review's 10 best books of the year. Julia has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Paris Review, and teaches at the Randolph College MFA program. A 2024 Guggenheim Fellow, she lives with her family in Brooklyn, and she gifted us her stroller, so I am now a Julia Phillips stroller owner, and we will be talking about Bear today. And then finally, Rachel Lyon is the author of Self-Portrait with Boy, a finalist for the Center for Fiction's 2018 First Novel Prize, and her short work has also appeared in One Story, The Rumpus, Electric Literature, and elsewhere. A co-founder of Ditmas Lit and the Dream Away reading series, and a creative writing instructor for various institutions, most recently Bennington College, where I teach right now. Rachel has been appointed the 2024 Paris Writer in Residence. She lives with her husband and 2 young children in Western Massachusetts, and we will be talking about Fruit of the Dead. So these are all extraordinary novels that have so much sort of overlapping interest and intrigue, and darkness and feminism. But I want to start with the sort of topic for our panel today, which is reimagining classics. All of these novels are based on some kind of foundational myth, from fairy tales to Greek legends to primeval cults, to the way that our own families embed themselves in our bloodstream over the course of generations, like nesting matryoshka dolls. So I'm curious, which came first in your writing process, your own story that you wanted to tell, or the myth that you wanted to twist? And in the process of sort of reclaiming these myths, did you find them to be useful guardrails in terms of form, or were they ever constraining?
So in my novel, there's 2 storylines. There's a woman in LA, and that's the contemporary storyline. And she's pregnant and gets a call from a psychic medium who's channeling her great-grandmother, who was a Russian revolutionary. So the story of her great-grandmother is like the historical fiction part, and then the contemporary story is happening simultaneously. So when I started writing, it was the historical thing that came first. I knew I wanted to write about the Russian Revolution. I was born in Russia. My family, they weren't necessarily like revolutionaries, but it was just a part of my history. And I was thinking about what I inherited, what is sort of my own stuff, what was passed down to me. I was thinking about all these questions. And I think to really answer them, I needed to have both like the origin point of the trauma or the story, and then to see kind of to trace its effects, it's like the modern part. But I was interested in the historical part first, and then it was a question of bringing it into the present. Yeah.
And there are ghosts in your book and in the room.
There are ghosts in my book, so this does seem like a very appropriate thing to be happening.
And would you mind reading a short section from it just so that we can hear your voice?
Sure. Okay. Zhenya poured herself tea and called the number back. A man answered. Zhenya, he said, before she had a chance to introduce herself. I'm so glad you called. My name is Paul Zelmont. He had a wet way of speaking. She pictured him having thick, damp lips. I'm a medium. Perhaps you've heard of me? She hadn't. I'm well known in some circles. I have a website. She went over to her laptop and Googled him as he talked. The man who came up in the images looked eerily like what she'd been picturing. Or perhaps what she'd pictured was vague enough that it transformed into this man. Head shaved bald, white stubble on his cheeks, prying eyes, and yes, thick, wet lips. She was right about that. On the website, it said he charged $350 for a 15-minute consult. I've been talking to your great-grandmother, he continued, and I need your help. Okay. Zhenya tensed and stepped out onto the balcony. For a scam, this seemed weirdly involved. Did she leave me an inheritance and you just need to know my bank account number so you can transfer me the money? The man laughed. Nothing like that. I know it's strange for you to be getting this call out of nowhere. Her name was Irina Petrovna. She's on your matrilineal line. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Okay. Hi. Okay, so in terms of the reimagining of the text, this book there's actually three, I say there's three separate storylines, and there is, for this book, there is a lost Greek comedy, supposedly written by Aristophanes, that I got to write, which was really fun for me. So, and I based the structure of the play, which is called Apocrypha, on Aristophanes' play Lysistrata. So structurally, it was really helpful. The play, your question about whether it was restrictive or helpful. I'm someone, I tend to like restrictions. They tend to allow me to go more sort of crazy within the guidelines, of restrictions. So I've been asked before if so the main storyline is set in Nashville during the American Civil War, and the book was inspired by the fact that Nashville attempted to exile all of their prostitutes one day in August of 1863. They rounded them up, they put them all onto a riverboat that was far too small for all of them, and they shipped them off. They ended up coming back a month later because no one would take them. No one would take the prostitutes in, but that was the genesis of the book. But the part of the story that is sort of a reimagining or a reformation is the play that is contained within the book that is based on Aristophanes' very famous play Lysistrata, in which the women of ancient Greece withhold sex from their husbands and boyfriends and men so that they will stop fighting. So that is woven into the Nashville storyline, which is helmed by a woman named Sylvie Swift. So I created her. She's fictional, but then there are other actual characters who were in Nashville at the time who appear and pop up in the book. Even John Wilkes Booth makes an appearance in the book on stage. But generally for me, my writing is, I'm a fabulist. I think of myself as a fabulist. I think that's just kind of the most apt way to describe my work, in that it's generally reality with some sort of twist that asks you to look at our lives in a different way or from a new angle. So I found both the historical restrictions and the sort of form restrictions, to me, they're helpful as a writer. Other writers do not find them to be as helpful, I think, or more restrictive or something. But anyway.
And would you mind reading a little bit?
Sure, I'll read. I'm going to read something. The book is a series of journal entries that's interspersed with letters and newspaper articles and pieces of this play. So I'm going to read just, this one is kind of gives a look at Nashville at this time. Saturday, June 9th, 1877. The address given me by Colonel Truesdale was 10 blocks from the land of the Sirens at the corner of Spring and Spruce Streets. On a sunny autumn afternoon, I moved westward through the riverfront neighborhood known as Smoky Row, part business district, part red light district, so packed with bar rooms, warehouses, and theaters, eateries, foundries, and storefronts, boarding houses, and brothels. Streets thick with soldiers and citizenry, with untended livestock, and men hawking patent medicines, elixirs, and nostrums, with drunkards and streetwalkers, and legless soldiers rattling cups for coins. At one point, the flood of horse, mule, and ox-drawn vehicles surging along Spring was interrupted by 6 draft horses, all sat by federal cavalrymen, towing a limber loaded with boxed ammunition, as well as a 24-pound bronze cannon of the sort known as a Napoleon. The spoked wheels supporting the caisson and gun were as tall as the horses' backs, and the gun carriage and limber creaked ominously as they spiraled over the street. A second artillery team trotted by, then a third came into view. I paused to watch and grew so engrossed in the procession that I didn't notice the urchins until they had me surrounded. They were the same filthy children I'd seen the day of my arrival, one of whom had growled at me. So slicked with grime, so muffled in tattered rags were they that I could not guess their sexes. The ragamuffins numbered at least 24, and they seemed both frightened of and fascinated by me. Those nearest reached out hesitantly, petting my skirts, my bodice, my hands. "Hello," I said. The children took a collective step back. "My name is Sylvie." Stop there.
Thank you.
My book, Bear, is based on a fairy tale, a Brothers Grimm fairy tale called Snow White and Rose Red that I loved as a kid. So for me, that fairy tale absolutely came first. It is the story of, have folks read it before? I don't know. Yeah. So it's not a major fairy tale in the collection. It's an odd one about 2 sisters who live in a cottage, and then a bear comes to their door. And the bear turns out to be a prince in disguise, and they kind of roll on the floor with him and put their hands in his fur and do all sorts of things that, as a kid, I thought, what is happening here? and then eventually he turns out to be an enchanted prince, and one of them marries him, and the other one marries his brother, and it ends in the way that fairy tales do. And as a kid, I was really captivated by this story, but I found the actual plot of it to be dissatisfying. Like, I loved the images, I loved the dynamic, I loved the relationship, but what happens in the story has like a dwarf and an eagle and treasure, and it all sort of goes far afield of what to me was the part that kind of drew and obsessed me, which was this bear relationship. And so when I started this project, it was really intended to capture that early obsession. And I took the elements that I loved the most, which were these sisters and this mother and this cottage in the woods and this bear, and I got to put them in a new form, which was really, really satisfying. So it was not constraining. It was liberating in a way to know I was not following the plot, but I wanted to kind of like touch the heart that I had loved so much. I'm guessing I should read a little bit. Should I read a little bit,
I'm going to skip
Katy?
you, Julia. We don't want.
Okay,
Yeah.
forget it.
Would you mind reading a little bit, Julia?
This is just from the beginning. Like Cinderella picking lentils from the ashes, Sam was a nobody doing work that meant nothing, but no prince was ever going to pluck her out of this. She saw them all the time on the boat, these royal types. The usual wealthy with their salt and pepper hair and orthodontist street and smiles. The celebrities and Seattle tech millionaires, meanwhile, glowed at the gas station after getting to the island by private plane. They didn't see her. They never would. Young as she was, Sam had lived long enough to know who could be counted on and who couldn't, who could be trusted and who had to be put up with in order to pay the bills. Broad-shouldered men lined up before her all day long. It didn't matter. Elena was the only one who would save her from this place. They were going to have to save each other.
Thank you.
Hi. Is it working? Is it working? Yes. So Fruit of the Dead sort of started as, it did not start with the tale of Persephone, although it is a sort of reimagining of the story of Persephone and Demeter, which, if you need a refresher, Persephone is a nymph, demigoddess. She's the daughter of Demeter, who's the goddess of the harvest. She's hanging out in a field, plucking flowers with her nymph friends, when one day the earth opens up underneath her, and Hades abducts her and brings her down to the underworld, makes her his queen, rapes her, and her mother starts looking for her, right? And so in the myth, part of what sort of disturbed and interested me about the myth was that when Demeter is looking for her daughter, the other gods refuse to tell her where her daughter is, even though some of them are aware. So everyone's sort of complicit in this rape and abduction of Persephone. Demeter forsakes her job. The harvests are all blighted and die, and the people on Earth start to starve as she drops everything to look for her daughter. Eventually, she figures out she's in the underworld. She's tipped off, I think, by Hecate, and she comes down to the underworld and negotiates with Hades to bring Persephone back. Persephone has eaten of the fruit of the dead, which is pomegranate seeds in the myth. So she eats 6 pomegranate seeds, which bind her to the underworld, unbeknownst to her or anyone else. It's sort of like a last-minute rule that's thrown into the myth at the very end. Oh, psych! You have to stay here for 6 months out of the year. So she's in Hades for 6 months. She's on Earth for 6 months, and thus we have spring. So she's the goddess of the spring. But when I started this book, I was really just working on a much simpler novel in my mind about a babysitter working for a powerful man who, and they get entangled, right? They get emotionally and sexually entangled. I was interested in these stories that were coming up at the time through the Me Too movement and associated conversations about power and sex and, what that means for each party involved. And it struck me as I was maybe a third of the way into this novel manuscript that the story that I was working on mimicked the arc and shape of the story of Persephone. So that's when I started sort of working with the myth. And I did find that, as Jen said, it felt like it opened up some really exciting new opportunities as I was working on it. Like all these strange, the myth that I was really just working with one text, which is the Homeric hymn to Demeter. It was a translation from 1915, so it still had all this sort of ornate, elevated language, really poetic language. So I loved the language, and then I loved the sort of oddness of the myth and how strange it was. For instance, Demeter, the Demeter character, spends too much time by contemporary novelist standards on this weird sort of tangent where she sort of gives up looking for her daughter and works for a while as she disguises herself as a crone, and she works as a wet nurse for a human family, a mortal family. And she's sort of tempted, strangely, to dip this mortal baby in fire to immortalize him, because she sort of falls in love with the baby. His mother walks in, sees what she's doing, flies into a rage. Demeter unveils herself, in all of her beauty and glory, and says, I'm Demeter, don't challenge me. They have this, it's bananas. It's a very strange moment. So I was working on the book after incorporating the myth, and I started having doubts because of moments like that, thinking, what is this doing here in this story? Like, it doesn't seem, if you read a novel where this happened, wouldn't it seem weird? Wouldn't you cut it? And I was talking to another writer friend, and she was like, no, you have to try, right? Like, that's so odd and so interesting. It sounds like a great creative challenge. So moments like that did present interesting creative challenges. I'm not sure, it's up to the reader to decide if it works or not in my book, but it was really fun to give it a shot and sort of play with it.
Cool. Would you mind reading a little bit?
Sure. So the book alternates perspectives. It's chapter by chapter. So it's in Corey's perspective. Corey is the daughter, and Demeter's perspective. Emer is the name of the mother. And the Emer sections are in the first person. So I'm going to read from one of those. When she was a little girl, my Corey's beauty was so extraordinary it was almost frightening. Semi-precious eyes and hair as light and fine as memory, glass-blown lips that shattered easily into wide-open gusts of smiles. Strangers gave her gifts, free samples, opportunities. Maitre d's comped her desserts. At a Paris boutique, she was given sample-sized dresses. At an aquarium in Florida, she was chosen from the crowd to feed a killer whale. Her beauty has been, for me, a source of pride, anxiety, and yes, envy. Girls who are born with the misfortune of being average or even homely, I know them, I have been them. The pains they take to camouflage their acne with concealer, to tame the hair their hormones ruin with grease and frizz. The volume of their sad, false laughter, the way they shrink into the furniture, their insecurity leaches into the air around them, into the groundwater. As someone who's worked for what beauty I now have, which is to say for an approximation of it, for poise and style, I admit that at my worst, they inspire a pity in me, akin to loathing. Since Corey, though, I've learned true beauty is a mixed blessing. Corey has done what she can to muffle hers. Her ill-fitting, mismatched outfits are the stuff of sitcom clowns. Her posture is a masterclass in spinal contortion. She does not wash her face. And yet, as smog and atmospheric detritus amplify the colors of a sunset, in spite of her best efforts at self-pollution, her beauty shines perversely brighter. Under her iridescent eyes, day-old mascara smears look high fashion. Slicked with a sheen of oil, her skin looks only more taut and poreless. Picture her now in threadbare tee and spandex shorts, scrolling through her phone in the window seat. Afternoon sun squeezed through the buildings on the west side of the street makes of her unbrushed hair a wispy nimbus. Sweet otherworldly girl, as alien as she is angel, leggy love child of Ziggy Stardust and the Fairy Queen, my core, my corazon, my girl, my life. Where have you gone? Thank you.
All four of these novels feature insistent and imperfect young female narrators who are struggling to make their stamp on the world, but have pretty glaring blindnesses. The reader at many points wants to take them by the shoulders and shake them. And so I'm curious about your own relationships with youth and womanhood, and what sort of personal wells you were drawing from in creating these characters. And I'll start with Rachel this time and go that way.
Oh, sure. I was thinking a lot about my own youth writing this book, and I don't know, I feel like we're all relatively similar ages. Like, I came of age at the end of the 20th century, the end of the last century, when I think kids who are growing up today are facing very different challenges, the kind of challenges that we were looking at in high school were like, sexism was like loud and, neon colored. It was impossible to get around. So I was thinking a lot about that, and a lot about the sort of mistakes that encourages one to make, and how we sort of warp ourselves and change our shapes to fit into the puzzle-sized pieces that we're given as kids. Yeah.
think when I was working on this book, it's from the perspective of yes, one youngish woman who sometimes folks want to take by the shoulders and shake. And when I was building her character, I was thinking about a quality that she has that I do think is associated with youth, that is that more younger people have it than folks who are more mature, but I don't think every young person is this way, and I think that maybe some older people are this way, which is that she's very, very loyal. She prizes loyalty. And her loyalty makes her very committed to a person or to an ideal or to a dream. And maybe you could call that stubborn too, right? Like very, very stubborn. She doesn't let go of things. And I have a touch of that in myself, and I also have friends who have a lot of that. I've had friends who have a lot of that, and it makes them wonderful friends, and it also makes them hard friends because they have such high standards of how they think things should be, and they don't compromise. And her particular strain of uncompromising loyalty was one that I really wanted to put on the page. And I think maybe it overlaps with a kind of womanhood, or overlaps with a kind of youth. But it really, I don't know, maybe when she's 85 years old, she'll still be this woman. I don't know.
Let's see. So Sylvie Swift, the character of my book, is looking back. So there's a narrative distance. She's looking back from 15 years on. So she's 37 or 38 when she's actually writing. So her 22-year-old self is being delivered through the lens of, who she is now as a 37-year-old woman. So that was nice for me to be able to use that distance to shore up, because I'm so far from 22 at this point that I have a hard time. I'm sorry if I'm getting too close to this. I have a hard time even remembering being that young. But I think as a young woman, I felt like it's like what Rachel was saying. I'm a product of the 20th century because that's when I really was made, and we were surrounded by the kind of sexism that was it just went unnoticed. We didn't even realize anything was happening. Like the place where I went in my junior high school, there was women, the young women or the girls that were going to school there, we were sexually assaulted in the halls of our school every day. This is in Arkansas. I grew up in Arkansas. So, it was as in we were manhandled, we were grabbed every day. And that was just life. So, it's hard for someone of my generation to that's the kind of confusion that I grew up in as a young woman. I wanted to create a character who feels to me more like a woman who's confused and is struggling and sort of doing her best to figure out how to proceed in a world in which almost everything is set against her. And sort of give her, I wanted to make Sylvie feel, especially because Sylvie's living in the late or the mid 19th century. So she had even more, complete pushback against her doing anything on her own. Women of her generation lived completely at the whim of their male relatives. So one of the challenges, I guess, in creating her was I wanted her to feel realistically like a woman of her time, but I also wanted her to feel curious and strong and, be a really engaging character. Because I feel like, my story started not with Sylvie, but with the events. I'm sort of an idea or a situational writer. So then I had to find Sylvie. And in order to create her, I really, in a lot of ways, I looked to myself and my own experiences. Because I'm not someone who writes, I haven't written from the female perspective nearly as much traditionally as I have from the male perspective. So this was, one of the great things about writing this book was I really learned so much about about being a woman and how I have approached being a woman, how I could potentially approach being a woman in the future. It was just a very enlightening experience for me as a woman to write this book. So anyway, sorry if that was too much or off topic.
Yeah, I love this question. So in my book, Xenia is an immigrant. She comes to the U.S. as a small child with her mom and her grandmother. And there's just kind of this people have like a fight, flight, or freeze response to trauma. And I think for her, it's kind of like she's sort of frozen. And the trauma isn't, I think the immigration and what happened with her parents and stuff was difficult, but the trauma is really not so much hers, it's the inherited trauma from her great-grandmother and then her grandmother. Her great-grandmother had left her grandmother in an orphanage and gone to the United States, so she was raised by her grandmother and her mother, and she didn't know her dad, and then they came to the US when she was like 5. So I think she's a person who doesn't really feel like she has any agency, and as a result, she does a lot of things that aren't great to other people because it doesn't even occur to her that what she does could be hurtful, because she thinks like, little old me, like I don't matter, like nothing I do matters. So I think it's sort of like a way that she justifies doing like a lot of things in her friendships and her marriage that aren't likable. And I think, aren't great. But the book is also sort of a coming-of-age story because through having a child, it forces her to reckon with a lot of these things. It forces her to reckon with her past, and her ancestral past, but also with her own behavior. And to kind of pick a life for herself that even if it on the outside doesn't look like her mother wouldn't approve or whatever, it is like something that she genuinely wants. And it's a coming-of-age story where she sort of is figuring out what it is that she really wants. And it's not like by the end she becomes this fully realized person who makes the best choices necessarily or is honest with everyone around her, but at least she's on that path, And so this is just the beginning of that path of growing up, basically.
Yeah, and you make the really interesting point that even the act of becoming a mother is not necessarily redemptive in any way.
No.
It's just like another step on this inevitable.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different models for motherhood in this book. There's a lot of bad mothers, good mothers, if you want to think of it in those types of terms. But there's some people who find meaning in motherhood and some who do not, and I think there's a range.
Yeah.
But she happens to find a lot of meaning in motherhood.
Right. It makes me think of this line from Jen's book. You write, "To be a woman is to change, from girl to maid, from bride to mother, from matron to crone." And it's just such a, again, talking about myth. It's like these roles that women move through in our lives, from the young ingenue to the doting sacrificial mother to the crone who no one is interested in listening to or looking at. None of those roles are satisfying. But I want to shift to the mother role because all of you have very primal mother moments in your novel, in your novels, from mothers being invoked in moments of extremis, mothers coming to the rescue, mothers slipping away as characters need them the most. I became a mother last year, and I suddenly find it the most narratively rich vein in the human experience. I think of it sort of like religion. It is something that is baked into characters' bones and can either propel them to action or damn them in some way. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you conceived of motherhood in these books and how you avoided the trap of sentimentality, which you all successfully did. I'll start down with you, Katya.
As I mentioned, there's a lot of mothers in my book. It's 4 generations of daughters and mothers. And Zhenya's own mother, I think initially comes off as very cold and overly critical. And Zhenya's very close with her grandmother growing up. And her grandmother was like a very nurturing, warm presence to Zhenya, but as a mother to her mother was pretty terrible. So it's like a really interesting sort of shifting dynamic where the 3 of them live together as while Zhenya's growing up. And there's kind of no space for her mother to be the mother because the grandmother is kind of taking that role. But after the grandmother dies, there's like a shift that happens in the mother-daughter relationship, and there's like space for it to develop. Yeah, and as for Zhenya becoming a mother, I mean, when I became a mother, it was kind of the first time when I started thinking about myself in a chain of people, and what was it that was being given to me? What am I passing on to my daughter? You know, so much of what we pass on is not conscious. It's not something that we decide to pass on. It's just we aren't even aware of it. And this really interesting thing happened when I was. So my grandmother wrote these memoirs about her life, and she gave them to me, and they sat on my computer unread for years. And I couldn't bring myself to read them, even though I was very curious about her life. There was just, I knew that there would be so much trauma in there, and it would be so difficult. She survived the Holocaust. She escaped from Poland, like on foot. It was a lot. And and there was something in me that just resisted reading it. Like, I just couldn't. It wasn't that I wasn't interested. I just emotionally couldn't bring myself to. But then after she died, like the night of her funeral, actually, I started reading them, and I started translating them because they were in Russian. And I thought my daughter might one day want to read them. And then I started also like kind of talking to her in the margins, like asking her questions. It felt like I was in a dialogue with my dead grandmother, which this book is, you know, a person who's in dialogue with a ghost, and that was exactly what was happening. And it was so interesting to finally read it, and it was heavy at times, and it was just strange. Like, her memoir was so strange because there was so much stuff that wasn't written about that felt like in the absence, like I could feel the absence of it. It was like the negative space was heavy in that book. Like, she would talk about my dad and his like constipation at summer camp for like pages, and then there's nothing about like her marriage to my grandfather, you know, and it's like, what is in between these lines, you know, like what does that mean? And so I was writing all of these questions about what does this mean in the margins. But like one thing that was so interesting about reading it is I could see all these patterns in myself and in my writing from reading her memoir, and it was like so clear that it was passed on to me without me even being conscious of it, you know? Like, there's so much like in terms of like hypervigilance or anxiety or being like constantly on edge, and that comes across, I think, in my writing too. And like a weird sense of humor, which I have. So anyway, I think it was really like interesting to see what was passed on unintentionally by just reading the text. Yeah.
That's really cool. That's so cool. I wish I had something like that to read. I might be the only person up here who is not actually a mother then. I do not have any biological children. I have 2 stepchildren who are wonderful, but they were pretty much grown when I met them. But this book is absolutely about motherhood and like the point of view character. I mean, you know, so I've experienced the mother-daughter relationship from a daughter perspective only, I had a brilliant, you know, wild, funny mother who really desperately wanted to be a writer. So that's basically why I'm here. In terms of the character of Sylvie, Swift, who's the main character in the book, she loses her mother when, you know, this is 19th century, this happened all the time, and still, unfortunately, you know, happens. But her mother died after giving birth to her and her twin brother. So she has an absent mother. She has kind of the idea of a mother throughout the book. Her father, and then the death of her mother really destroys her father, who falls on hard times and has a hard time like taking care of the children, so they basically have to raise themselves. But one of the best things about writing this book is that I do deal with another mother character, and that character is Chaos, who is, so in Greek mythology, I am like the myth of Persephone is like so ingrained into me, like you telling it, you know, it's like, it is so important to me as well. But so in Greek cosmology, the first deity, this is the absence of everything else, the void, the darkness, is Chaos. Chaos was the name of the goddess out of which everything else sprung. The earth, people, monsters, titans, gods. So chaos, when I began to understand that the way that the book was going to unfold, and I was working on this play that I wrote for the book, and chaos, the character, entered the play, I had to revamp the entire book at that point, because I realized that I was going to be writing about chaos as a mother figure, chaos as in, and I know that chaos, I'm not saying I'm not someone who is like, oh, I love chaos, right? I'm someone who, I'm pretty regimented, because I think the interior is fairly chaotic for a lot of writers, so the outside, we need structure and order. But I think that the Greeks' idea of chaos as being the unknowable, the absolute magic unknown, which we will never be able to explain, they assigned that the role of the female goddess that gave birth to literally everything else that has come since. And that idea really, really excited me. And so it has given me, writing this book has also given me a completely different perspective on the concept of chaos, and how in the human world that we have created, we all want order, we all want for things to be orderly. That's easier to deal with. But chaos is where creation happens. Chaos is where things are made. If you have ever made a piece of art at all, you know that there is a struggle. There is always a struggle. And so there's a part of me that, as I wrote this book, wanted to begin to find a way to celebrate that aspect of chaos, the unknown, and motherhood. And the matrices, it is the one place, I'm someone who has always wanted to see something supernatural happen, right? I am like, where's a ghost? Where is a, werewolf? Can I get, but I love the supernatural, but I've never experienced anything supernatural. The one supernatural event, thing that I know of is life, the way that we create life, the way that life is created inside of a woman. So I think that is the most supernatural thing that we have. And it's all about, that's motherhood. That is, the handing down. So there's a way in which the absolute power of motherhood and the idea of chaos is something that we could potentially use to our advantage, that isn't, that is necessary. It was all very exciting to find those, and it's all linked to motherhood, in my book. So sorry if I'm rambling too much.
It's so cool. The best analogies I know for writing for me are like dreaming or like quilting, where you sort of take these pieces of your own life or experience and you stitch them together into something that is other than you, but is recognizable to you, but also recognizable to other people. And it's such a pleasure to hear everyone talking about their own experiences and histories and lives, and then get to see how they quilt together into these books. It's very cool. I also was doing some, in the chaotic mystery of art making, I had entered into parenthood in my own life the year before I started this project. And it's interesting to me, I haven't found myself able yet to write about parenthood or motherhood in my own experience yet, because it is a very rich experience that I am unable to get my teeth around. But how it wound up kind of quilting through, I like listening to her, honestly.
She knows all she needs to know.
I like what she has to say, and I like the way she says it. I want to hear more. The way it ended up coming through in this work is that these two sisters who live with their mother is ill. She's terminally ill, and she's been terminally ill for a long time. So she's kind of been on a 10-year decline. She got sick, she was diagnosed, and it's taken, the course of her illness has been a lot slower and more painful for their family than they realized. So both these sisters are caretakers of their mother. And I wanted to write about their experience as daughters and caretakers, really for two reasons. One reason was that I was doing my own caretaking at the time. Rachel and I were together in having babies the summer of 2020, which was an intense experience. And an intense experience of caretaking because, like, your friends, no one's coming over to hold that baby. You know, everyone's, at least for us, like, we were not with any family, we were not with any friends. Nobody touched the baby. If we stood outside on the sidewalk with masks on and looked at each other from 15 feet apart, afterwards you'd be worried that, like, you killed yourself and your infant and your aged relative. You know, it was not, I don't know if anyone had a really chill time that summer. I hope that you did, but I did not. I'm not a very relaxed frame of mind. And the intensity and solitude of that caretaking experience, coupled with the beauty of it and the kind of, like, awe and glory of it, how special it was. You knew this time was so temporary, that you would get to be in this particular phase, and it meant so much. I wanted to put that on the page, that every single day they're kind of thinking, like, when will this be over? It'll end with her death. We all know that. And we don't want it to come, but it'll be a relief when it comes. But I don't want it to come, but it'll be that kind of back and forth of caretaking. I wanted to record that. I also wanted to put down something that I think I've been thinking about as a daughter and also as a parent now, which is the certain loss of your parents. You know, like, you're born into a world where your parents are already adults, and you say, okay, you know, I only have a certain amount of time with them. And also the crushing loss of them. And the sisters in this book are really grappling with that. They're facing their mother's mortality specifically, and they've been sort of rehearsing a long time for how that'll feel, and yet they have no idea how it'll feel when it actually happens. And I really wanted to put that down.
Yeah.
I love these answers. This is such a good panel. I feel like, so yes, I became a mother also in 2020, in July of 2020. And I had already been working on this book for 2.5 years at that point. And I was pretty determined not to include the mother's perspective at all in this. Every treatment of the Persephone myth that I had read only told the story from Demeter's perspective. Right. So I was really determined, no, I'm going to give voice to the victim, to the voiceless, you know, in the grand, you know, statement of our times, and only really tell the story from the perspective of Corey, who's the Persephone character. But then I became a mother during a very difficult time, and I couldn't resist. I mean, I really needed to. I sort of had the opposite reaction. I was like, I need to process this right now, you know, on the page. And so there were a couple reasons why I felt like I needed to include her voice. The first was I needed to write about what was going on with me. And the second was, as Persephone, or the Corey, who's the Persephone character in the book, develops pretty quickly. The treatment of the fruit of the dead in the book, it's not pomegranate seeds that she's getting hooked on. It's a drug that the pharmaceutical executive she's working for has not yet brought to market, sort of an opioid-esque, but also psychedelic-esque drug that she gets really interested in. She's 18. And so as I was writing from her perspective, I really wanted to like get into that sort of trippy, freewheeling, like freedom-loving voice of an 18-year-old on drugs. I was like, this is really fun. It was really fun to write from that perspective. And it was really fascinating to me and freeing after my first book where I was I was very concerned about every single sentence and everything being just right and just perfect on the page. I wanted to challenge myself to sort of break out of that and allow myself these like long, tortuous, very lush sentences. But as I continued to write from that perspective, I realized we actually really needed like another set of eyes to see the story through, because I was getting a little lost, just as my character was in her perspective, and she was not really sure what's real anymore, and I can't let the reader also not be sure what's real anymore. So it was really useful to have this mother character, this very concerned mother character, telling us, yes, this is concerning. What's happening? You're okay. You're accurate. Your perception is accurate. You're right to be concerned for this girl. But as we go, so when the book starts, they've just had this sort of rupture where the teenage girl has confessed to her mom that she was assaulted by a classmate, and her mom has reacted by clamming up, getting up and walking out of the room because she can't really deal with hearing this. She herself is a victim of abuse, and she can't handle it. So rather than it creating a closer bond between these women, it's fractured their bond, and that's where we're starting when the book begins. And so over the course of the book, the mother character really has to break down all of that resistance within her, and she kind of has a breakdown in that process. And so when Demeter finally comes to rescue Persephone, spoiler alert, she is a very different woman than she was at the beginning of the book. A lot of her whole sort of persona and her exterior has changed along with her interior, and they are able to come together in a realer and more authentic way.
Yeah, I think one really interesting thing is that we often think of books as being the products of minds that are separate from ourselves, that a writer writes something and then you read it and the writer is a kind of invisible presence somewhere in the background. But the things that panels like this can do is show us how intimately involved all of ourselves, our souls are in these sentences. Even if we're writing about something that happened 200 years ago or 5,000 years ago, it's our blood and our tears that are fertilizing these worlds. And I think we should talk about that more often, and I'm so happy that y'all are all able to sort of open up to us today. We have like a minute and a half left. If anyone has a very fast question.
This is born of my being the mother of twins. So Jen, we certainly have an example in ancient literature of twins, but I wanted, and y'all might have twins in your books. I haven't read them yet. But why did you feel like it was important? Sometimes I feel like, I don't know, I hate to say this, it's a little bit of a cop-out to do twins, like it's too easy.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've always been obsessed with twins. Like, I don't know why. Like, as a professor, I've had twin students who, like, I can tell them, even if they're identical and they can fool the other teachers, I'm like, I know who you are. I don't know why. I've always been fascinated by the notion that two individual separate beings come from the same, that one egg separates into two individuals. And the idea of, I guess this is sort of cheeseball, but like the idea that twins can sort of, is anyone up here a twin, or are you twins in the family? Okay.
Twins in the room.
The idea that they can communicate telekinetically and know what each other are thinking and feeling, and that twins who are separated at birth a lot of times will have a lot of similarities. But for the character of Sylvie, one reason that I made her and her brother Silas twins is because I wanted them to echo Artemis and Apollo, as they do in the play. So there's Sylvie and Silas are sort of analogs, right, for Artemis and Apollo, the Greek gods who appear in the play. So that was one reason. But I've just always loved twins. I love twinning. I love in literature, there's a tradition of twinning, pairing two people together, one who's dark, one who's light, The Secret Share, Joseph Conrad, I don't know. But anyway, it's just one of my personal, I think writers have like a set of personal obsessions, and twins has always been one of mine. So that's one reason. But
Thank
I'm
you.
not myself a twin, nor, in my family, it's not a tradition, but.
All of these authors will be signing at 12:15, so please bring them your questions and bring them purchased copies of their books for them to sign. Thank you
That'd be
so
great.
much.
Thank you.